Now, associated with the HK29 ceremonial complex is another thing that gives us a big hint about what's going on there. And that's the two sites at HK24A and HK24B, which are essentially breweries. We have two large complexes, and each of them contain multiple vats stuck into parallel rows. And you can kind of see that here from HK24. See all these small circles here represented. You have 6 vats that are put into this that are preserved here. And what we tend to think, based on our excavation, you can see on here in the reconstruction, is you sink those jars into a mud brick platform, and then you put a dome structure over the top of it. So the opening of the jar is available for you to access its contents. But the dome itself kind of serves as an oven, so you can heat this jar up. And we start thinking about the steps of producing beer here. You take your grains, your malted barley, and you add water and you boil it to get that started. And then you add something to help kind of kickstart the fermentation process after the fact. So the boiling here, you get that mash going to release some of the sugar within the grain is an important step. So this would have aided in the production of the beer here. And then it also would have helped it cool and ferment, kept it protected in the 3 to 5 days or so it would have taken to ferment. So we can kind of think about the production of this more or less taking a week within that installation. Now, the other thing to kind of start thinking about is that if these were used in conjunction with each other, then what we can kind of look at is that each of these would have been kind of alternated to make sure that you're producing enough beer so you don't run out of beer, because it has to be consumed within 3 to 5 days after production. So you can kind of start looking at this as probably one of multiple aspects of these at the site. Now, between these two installations alone, the output here could produce about 600 gallons a week if they were both operating at the same time. Now, if we start thinking about how much beer that is, like a keg is 15 gallons, right? So we can start to look at this, that each of these, if they were produced at the same time, could produce about 40 kegs of beer. Now, when we start looking about why would you need 40 kegs of beer, right, we can start thinking about some other kind of structural issues here within Egyptian history. We know within the Old Kingdom, for example, beer was the daily ration for people, right? Because, well, one, you need hydration, and water from the Nile isn't safe to drink. So people tend to get sick, things like dysentery and cholera, when you drink dirty water. So you have this large settlement, and the water's not safe to drink. So what do you drink? Well, you drink beer. The boiling and the fermentation process helps to remove all of that bacteria, so beer is safe to drink. Um, so when we kind of look at this is probably part of this, but we also have to think about beer here as not being beer as in like when we start thinking about Bud Light, right? This is kind of a gruely porridge or something. It would have had about an alcohol content of about 2 to 3%, and it would have had a lot of the spent grain with inside it. So it would have been also incredibly nutritious, a lot of caloric load that we don't see in modern beers. So this is not just kind of sustenance, not just kind of fun alcoholic drinking. This is a sustenance issue. And so we can kind of look at this about the 600 gallons of beer here would have provided the weekly rations for about 500 to 600 people in terms of this. So we can kind of look at the breweries here as not as providing alcohol for the day-to-day, for the drinking and kind of mind-altering substances of alcohol, but would have been kind of the day-to-day subsistence for much of the population. And if we look at how that you can control that, controlling somebody's food supply is a much more substantial measure of control for these elite institutions. So the leaders here producing this amount of beer, controlling the food, are expressing in a vast amount of control over society. Now, the other thing that we see is that each of these breweries is associated with large storage facilities and granaries. So we can kind of look at this as being not just the representation of the production of alcohol for the ritual ceremonies, but for the control over the day-to-day food supply within society. So HK24 here represents this large-scale production in a way that really transforms the relationship between ruler and ruled through this. Now, when we start to look at who those people are, we can see quite a bit of what this represents within the workers' cemetery found at HK 43. This is a 2 hectare cemetery south of the main settlement. Estimates suggest there are probably about 2,000 graves here, but 450 or so have been excavated this far. And most of our interments are relatively simple. They're pit graves with offerings of pottery and food. I think this is where we start to kind of look at the symbolic importance of the burials here. The things that people take with them to the grave are food, right? So bread, garlic, melon, beer, all being included, interred inside of these jars and vats for the afterlife, provisioning someone for the life after. Right, food becomes an important idea of nourishing their soul through this practice. And so, when we look at kind of the practices of the elite burials, we'll talk about a little bit later, we can see that represented here within the workers' cemetery. We do see a small number of personal adornments, things like stone daggers or bone combs, and a couple of things like polished stone bracelets or simple figurines, but there's not a lot of differentiation between the individuals within this cemetery. However, there are 21 individuals who show evidence of cut marks on their cervical vertebra, suggesting their dismemberment, that their bodies had been taken apart, and in particular the head. Now, there's some question about whether or not this was done intentionally, whether it's something like warfare, someone who was killed in battle, or taken a prisoner of war or captive, or even if it was just having their body prepared for the burial ceremony. Think again, something like mummification a little bit later. So these cut marks, there's still kind of questions about it, but they're significant enough. About 2% of excavated individuals show evidence here of basically decapitation. So it's kind of important to look at. So we can kind of see this pattern emerging here of individuals who are controlled by society through this separated from the higher classes that we'll talk about in a little bit at HK6.